Good morning and welcome to part 2 of the COVID-19 planning system changes and historic environment, part of the RTPI Online Series 2020, brought to you jointly by the RTPI Southeast and the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists. My name is Gareth Giles. I run a planning consultancy in Sussex called Whaleback Planning and Design, and have been a long-standing volunteer of the RTPI Southeast region, so it's a pleasure to host this event today. Today follows the part 1 event on the 28th of October, which many of you will have attended. But if you did miss that part 1 event, you can catch up on the RTPI YouTube page after today's webinar to better understand the background. And Susan has provided a link to that session in the chat section of your panel. Today's event will pick up many of the themes from the previous session and will take more of a debate format between the panelists. So it's not going to be presentations as such, but you can see the panelists' previous presentations on that previous YouTube clip. Today's panel consists of Peter Hinton, Chief Executive Officer of the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, Chris Wilford of architecture firm Ethos, Lisa Lamb, Head of Planning and Major Infrastructure at the National Trust, and Karen Britton, Planning Manager in Planning Policy and Heritage for Canterbury City Council. So welcome to all of our panelists and thank you for your time. A special welcome, in fact, to Karen as a former RTPI Southeast Awards winner and today's de facto spokesperson for the public sector, following some feedback from the last event, which pointed out that there was no local authority-based panelists, so we have resolved that today. Similar to the last event, we welcome questions from you as delegates watching throughout the debate. Please go to the chat section on the right side of your screen in the panel there. You can select questions to staff and that will go to myself and Susan, and I'll put those questions to the speakers during the debate. Following the debate, we will pose 3 poll questions based on some of the initial conclusions from the debate to gauge the views of the whole audience, and we'll try to report the answers to that back to you before the end of the session. To keep it simple, these poll questions will have binary answers and we encourage you to participate, but you're not obliged to answer if you're unsure. Since part 1 on the 28th of October, we're now in a new COVID lockdown, at least in England, which brings into sharp focus some of the drivers for the government's planning reforms, and particularly the white paper, as well as again highlighting the opportunities presented by virtual seminars like this. In the last session, we had a delegate from Poland, and today I think the furthest from the Southeast region is a delegate from Newcastle University. But if you think you're further away than that, then do let me know in the chat box and we'll update. I'm just going to summarise a few themes and also solutions and fixes that came out of the last session to set the scene for today. In reviewing the webcast and also the questions from delegates of the last session, there were literally dozens of points and ideas that were raised, so I'm going to try and just paraphrase those now, but I'll probably feed in some of those during the debate as well, but I'll try and pick out a handful just to set the scene. One of the main themes that did come out of the last event in light of the white paper was that probably the biggest risk of the new reforms is that the unknown heritage assets are an issue. We all know very well where the known heritage assets are, such as listed buildings and conservation areas, but 95% of heritage assets, particularly archaeological assets, are not designated. And the only way they can be identified and dealt with is through the planning process. So if we're having sweeping reform where land is designated into 3 areas and the only constraints that are known about upfront are those listed buildings and conservation areas, there's a big risk that unknown assets will be damaged or lost. So that was a major theme that seems not to be picked up particularly well through the white paper. Another main theme was that local decision making is critical. So although it's sort of slightly delocalizing in the new reforms, most delegates felt that local decision making is still very, very important, and LPA resourcing is therefore critical, particularly heritage expertise, which, as many of us know, has been reduced over the last 10 years or so. planning authorities may also need more historic information to be able to access than is held in the Historic Environment Record, or the HER for short. So if they're looking at designating areas, or areas are being designated for growth, the Historic Environment Record won't necessarily have all of the information that they need to look at the constraints in those areas. Some sites in growth and renewal areas will also need more detailed evaluation, such as on-site research, but again, it's unclear who's going to pay for that. It's usually applicants, because it's addressed through the planning application process. But if we're looking at sort of front-loading the system, who does that on-site research, who pays for it, whose expertise is employed to do that? There's also several comments about concerns that there's no mechanisms to secure mitigation once archaeology is found during the construction phase, in the absence of planning conditions or other mechanisms that we're used to. And there's a question about how unforeseen, again, unknown assets will be dealt with. Something that lots of people, including myself, were concerned about as well with the new PD rights is that they're restricted in conservation areas, and obviously they don't apply to listed buildings, but there's no control over the setting of listed buildings. That was something that lots of people raised in the last event, was that as listed buildings that are not in conservation areas have no protection of their setting against the PD rights. There was lots of other themes that I'll bring in during the debate, but some of the fixes or solutions that the panelists and delegates suggested, we can draw on these today as well, is that major sites should perhaps go through heritage testing before a permission in principle is granted, because once it's granted, it's perhaps too late to deal with anything. So there should be a layer of analysis or testing for heritage issues. We need more heritage skills and resources within local authorities. I think in the last event, one of the delegates mentioned that it was surprising that the generally private sector-based panel acknowledged that shortfall in local authority funding, but I think we sort of responded that we're not surprised because we're all in this together and we're all trying to achieve the same goals. And I think all parties agree that local authorities need proper resourcing for that skilled task of assessing and mitigating heritage. A well-resourced digital constraints map was also a key theme. Some authorities have better maps than others, but some authorities don't even identify listed buildings or conservation areas accurately. And again, what do we do about the unknown assets? I think there was some further suggestions for PD rights. Some people actually thought that changes of use should be allowed in listed buildings because it would enable them to be more dynamic in terms of responding to market needs. And it's obviously important to keep listed buildings in active, viable use to ensure their ongoing sort of maintenance and protection. And at the moment, changes of use of listed buildings can become quite complex and can be quite frustrated by the planning process as it stands. There was another potential fix for the protection of settings of listed buildings by using Article 4 directions. That's actually quite a good suggestion. Whether LPAs want to introduce an Article 4 direction for the setting of every listed building in their area is obviously to be thought about carefully, but that is one potential solution. People were suggesting that the three-tier approach of land designation is overly simplistic. And an overriding feeling that the power for planning decision-making for designations like World Heritage Sites should remain with the local authority, and they should be protected against carte blanche growth area designation, which is another good point. So that's just a flavour of the last session. Again, you can review the whole session on YouTube, but I think that's to give you a background if you didn't see it, or a reminder if you did. And we'll basically move on to a debate now. So I think as a sort of kick-off question, just to pump prime the panelists, I think a question might be, how much is heritage and heritage assets mentioned in the white paper, acknowledging that archaeology isn't mentioned at all? And are there satisfactory safeguards and opportunities for enhancement included in the white paper? So over to the panel. Lisa can kick off.
Brilliant. Am I off mute? Can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Fantastic. Oh, thank you for that, Gareth. Yeah, I mean, we were really pleased that the white paper obviously does mention heritage, and the sense we're getting from government is that it wants to enhance heritage protections through any new system. But equally, on the flip side of that, we are really concerned about what seems to us to be a very narrow definition of heritage. As you've already mentioned, 95% of archaeology isn't designated because it's unknown until there is a site-specific survey, and that feels incredibly worrying for us. I completely agree with the point you raised, Gareth, about setting. That is a real challenge in the new system, because it's incredibly hard to understand up front when you perhaps don't know the detail of the design code or what's coming forward, to assess the impact on setting. And it is a key consideration. The legislation says you must consider the impact on setting, so we have to find a way of addressing that. I think as well there's a couple of other things. I would be really concerned about cultural landscapes as well. I think they have a real cultural value, and they don't respect local authority boundaries or areas or zones. So I think there's a real challenge there for how the new system will deal with culture at scale. So cross-boundary issues feel really important. And for me, heritage is interwoven in the fabric of our towns and cities and places. It isn't a discrete constraint that is neatly lumped in one place, and actually what you can know is very limited. I think government have an almost simplistic view that, well, once you know where your listed buildings are, that's fine, you can just exclude them, and actually you can't. Many of our historic towns and centres have heritage at their core, and we would see quite often regeneration. Heritage is the linchpin for that, so it can add real value, and we do want our buildings to be used sensitively. We want that adaptive reuse. They shouldn't become conserved as they are. They need to innovate and to find new uses. And I think that's another concern we have, is that by kind of assuming that you can understand heritage at a given point in time and then you've done it, it sort of loses the sense that actually heritage is dynamic and changing. Our understanding is building all of the time, and there is something about changing significance as well that we feel could be lost with a really, really front-loaded system. I would also add non-designated heritage. So we've got the locally listed buildings, which are really important, but also just non-designated, locally important buildings. And again, that change in heritage. So the heritage of the future that we are not, listing or identifying now, but actually could be lost if we're not really, really paying attention to it. So I think it's good in as far as it goes in the white paper, but I would fundamentally disagree that the definition and the inclusion of heritage goes anywhere near far enough.
Thank you. Yes, Peter.
Thank you. Well, Gareth, I'm certainly not going to disagree with Lisa. Wouldn't dream of it. And perhaps just sort of preface my remarks before I add to those comments by saying that I am unusual here. I am not a planner, and there are many more insights and skills in the audience about archaeology and the planning process than I can offer. But I think, taking that sort of broad brush look that I have to take without that expertise, I agree. I think that there's a real problem in government thinking about the nature of heritage. The idea that you can identify it and draw lines around it is not the message that we've been conveying about heritage for the last 20 years or so. And I still haven't found a way of getting it across, but we need to find a way of persuading government that heritage it's a marinade, it's not a garnish. You don't just sprinkle it on top. It runs through the whole of our historic environment. Having said that, I've had a chance to meet with officials from MHCLG since our last event, and earlier on, I and others, Lisa too, has met with Robert Jenrick, and they do care. MHCLG does care about heritage. The minister does care. It is genuine. It's not one of those polite political, of course this is terribly important to me and there's a really nice listed building in my constituency. It's a genuine passion, but the problem is that there are gaps in understanding, and that's forgivable, but we need to overcome them. So one of them, I think, is about the all-pervasive nature of heritage. The other is a feeling that if we can just digitize the data, then we'll have all the information we need to make decisions. And we know that it's not about the accessibility of the data, it's about the existence of the data in many cases. There is a lot of primary research that's needed, as you mentioned earlier on, Gareth. And finally, I don't think, well, whilst the officials understand that there are unknowns, I don't think they understand the proportion of unknowns in the mix. So consequently, we don't really have an understanding of the number of cases in which further investigation is going to be needed following outline permission before any kind of safe building can take place that not only manages the risks for the developer, but also manages the opportunities to make a better place using heritage.
Thanks, Peter. I just wanted to actually pick up on that. It was your presentation in the last session that included the statistic that 95% of archaeological assets are undesignated, which I was really surprised about, actually. And you know, if you put that figure to ministers, then they must acknowledge that, as you say, having a digital map is only so good as the content of that map. And if it's missing 95% of the assets, then it's not very much use at all, I suppose.
Yeah, I wouldn't. Let me clarify that. I mean, 95% of assets it is a working figure. It varies around the country, but it's not of that order. Of heritage assets are not designated. That doesn't mean that they don't exist on the historic environment record. So, you know, in fact, you could probably say that a safer statistic to work is that 95% of entries on the historic environment record are undesignated. But, you know, rookie error number one is to assume that the blank spaces on the historic environment record aren't interesting places.
Right.
So, yeah, the point about the 95% is that there is no other management regime other than the planning system to look after those assets. But the other point is there's so much more that we don't understand, and decisions are being made, irrevocable decisions are planned to be made at very early stage in the process, and we need to work out, you know, that's a problem. The solution is, how do we resource local authorities either to undertake or to commission the level of research they need to do in order to allocate sites to zones before it's too late?
Thank you. Karen.
Yes, I think I'd agree with what's been said so far, actually, by Lisa and also Peter. In terms of designating 3 zones, I think that's something that we can look to do as local planning authorities. I quite see the emphasis and the sort of the trend that the government is trying to get to try and simplify things as much as possible for developers coming through, so that they can try and speed the processes up for them. I think the issues are that, as you mentioned, there's a lot of undesignated assets, and we don't know necessarily where everything is at this stage. Archaeology tends to come later in the process when you're starting to actually develop sites. So how do you actually draw lines around maps to show where they are? And instead, shouldn't there be some overriding policy that sits alongside the 3 zones, for example, just on the heritage side of things? I think also in terms of heritage assets that we do know about, and we mentioned earlier things like World Heritage Sites. Canterbury is obviously, it has a World Heritage Site for obvious reasons, and a lot of the designations, they might fall within one of these zones, so that might be a protection zone, for example, but the impact of actually development in some of the areas we might have as growth zones might actually impact the setting of our World Heritage Site, for example. So that there is this overlap that I think Lisa mentioned, where you could put something in a zone and parcel it up into that zone and say, okay, we know where our conservation areas are, we know where our World Heritage Site is, and so on. But it's things like the, you know, the important views or the buffer area of these things, the setting of these things, and those settings and so on may fall within other zones, which could be a renewal zone or a growth zone. So again, there's these kind of overlaps that I think that the zones in themselves are a good idea in principle, in theory, but there's a lot of overlaps between different things. And just talking from our perspective of Canterbury City Council, we've got conservation areas in all of our towns. So the centre of Canterbury, we've got Herne Bay and we've got Whitstable are our 3 towns within our district. and all of those are covered by conservation areas. So it's pretty big conservation areas in all of those places. But obviously, in terms of going forward, we don't want to see our heritage just sitting there doing nothing. We want that to play a part in regeneration and renewal. So, you know, there's that overlap again between protecting in terms of being a conservation area, but actually we want to renew some of those areas, and there might be sites within them where we need renewal and regeneration to help the town centres recover, and city centre. So there's these overlaps, I think, that happen within this new process that we need to get across to the government.
I think that's a really good point, and it kind of echoes the listed building comment from the last session, which is that we're certainly not saying that heritage is a completely preservation, conservation perspective either. I think heritage justice can facilitate growth and can be enhanced by growth and regeneration. So we're not saying that it's sort of the three-tier system isn't appropriate. It's just about acknowledging and essentially seeking to preserve and enhance as required by law. And yeah, listed buildings can benefit from rapid changes of uses and being more dynamic, as can conservation areas. So I think it's a really good point. Chris, you wanted to make a point?
Yeah, just coming from the design perspective and making better places, and the idea of those unknown assets. The white paper sort of emphasizes a lot the sort of the digital technological change they want to bring in, as we mentioned before, and the mapping, which is all well and good as a resource base, but and it's tagged COVID-19, and I think that's also a bit misleading, because this is a huge long process and it's a very big implication, and they're saying the changes might be temporary because of this COVID-19 situation, but it's a huge upheaval. It won't be temporary. You're going to do this properly or do it or not. So I think the danger is with all the digitalization is that you start to miss out on the consultation and the human touch. And there was a very, very well developed stakeholder community consultation process developed in the planning system. And that, I mean, I remember with Whitehill Borden and the original plans for the eco town, it's now a green town, I think. And understand it's an area, it's a military base, but it's an area steeped in archaeology. And it was through local consultation with the local history societies and things, where lots of this information about drove walks and hidden burrows came up that hadn't been documented. English Heritage hadn't got round to mapping everything, but there's a lot of local knowledge. And that came out, and it helped anchor any master plans or feasibilities coming forward in the community, and the listening helped inform the plan, basically. And we were picking up lots of rich knowledge, local knowledge, that you wouldn't get through digital mapping of existing sort of mapped information. So I think the sort of the stakeholder community consultation is a huge element. And whether it comes late in the process with a planning application or early in the plan forming stage, and I think the white paper is saying it's got to come early in the plan forming stage, and then we can get all of this information out and map it when we're trying to agree with the community, these simplified zones. But I'm wary of the digitalization element.
I think that's a good point. Thank you. Yeah, Karen.
Yeah, just coming back, I suppose, on the side of the consultations and digitalization of maps and so on. I think there is an emphasis in the white paper to try and get more IT into the planning process and up front, so that we do try to get all that data up front when we're putting the plan together, and making sure it's all kind of similar, I suppose, across the whole country. The emphasis seems to be on having a set package that all local planning authorities will use, so that it makes life simpler for everyone. They all know what they're using. They all know what kind of information they're going to be getting back to make people's lives easier, which is quite understandable. I think that obviously puts a lot of resource issues for local authorities as to, is it the expectation that the local planning authority will suddenly become great at setting up IT systems and managing all of this process? I think most local authorities, I don't know across the board everyone attending today, but most authorities, you know, they're lucky if they've got a GIS specialist in their actual planning department. Most of them will have that within the corporate side, within the council itself. and they're obviously doing work for other people in other departments as well. So there aren't that many people that are fortunate enough to have their own people doing all this information gathering and mapping for them. So there's a lot of other people that would need to be brought into the process across the council, but also potentially obviously private sector people that presumably will be writing these packages and then rolling them out across all local authorities in the country as to how you put your data in and what data is required in this new system. So I think there's a lot of workload there just in terms of IT and data gathering, which puts a lot of resource pressure on local authorities in particular. I think the other thing is that as well as gathering information and so on, it's also thinking about the consultation side that you mentioned, and we've tried to be very upfront in the start of our new local plan and get people involved before we've even started writing anything, and having meetings individually with parish councils, for example. And it's a really good thing, and I really appreciate all the information that's come back. It's very much like Chris was saying, you get a lot of information back from them as to what they think the issues are and what their aspirations are, but it is also very time consuming. And again, the current proposal seems to be that you'll have 6 months to do the gathering of information and call for site type timescale, and then you'll have a year to actually prepare a plan. So you've got a year and a half to gather all that information together, to get all your stats together and information and evidence, and prepare your plan as well. So I think the emphasis is probably, and my feeling is that the DM, development management type officers that would normally be doing planning applications, are going to have to start coming in and actually assisting the local plan side of the department, and actually helping to do all of this work and talk to people and get all these issues out in the open with developers who are putting forward sites. And that's not even going as far as what happens with master plans and design codes, because are we preparing them as well, or are developers preparing those to sit alongside their work? And again, that's obviously another workload to be checking other people's master plans or design codes, or actually preparing them ourselves. So I think there's a huge workload change around at the front end of the local plan making process.
Completely agreeing. With the best will in the world, 18 months is very, very, very short in local planning terms. I mean, having worked in a few different local authorities and then worked across from them in the private sector, I mean, local plans take a long time to produce, and it's not necessarily even about resourcing in terms of staff numbers. It's about consultation periods, the democratic process of going through committees. These things have kind of just a certain pace to them, which is difficult to achieve in that short period of time. Lisa and then Peter.
Thank you. Yeah, just to build really on what the other panelists have said, certainly the rollout of a single system that gives kind of consistency feels very appealing, but there is some nuance in the white paper. It talks about a modular system, and actually that makes me a bit nervous that some authorities might have more modules than others, so you might still get a bit of difference between authorities. That might be perfectly justified, but I think if you're going to standardize the system, it needs to be the standard or not, so that you know what you're getting. I completely agree with the resourcing. It's going to need IT skills and expertise, and I think actually the way consultations are done will need a slightly different skill set. Actually, it's going to be digital, it's going to be upfront, you're going to be getting different messages across to those communities, and I feel that assuming that local communities are going to be very enthused and engaged about a local plan process, and understanding that they are perhaps going to miss out on some more detailed consultation that they would ordinarily have had through the planning process, I think that message will be quite hard to get across. So I wish my local planning authority colleagues really good luck with that. And I think there is something for us that local communities tend to get involved when it feels real to them. They can understand what's happening. It's local, they know the area, they know the site as it is, but more importantly, they can see what's being proposed. And I guess as an organisation, we just feel that it might be quite abstract for people. I think I'm not convinced that actually people will very easily be able to visualise what's happening and what the ask is of them. Of course, there is the question of time as well. So you have a consultation before the areas are designated. What about the new people that move into that those kind of fluid populations who perhaps weren't around when that consultation was out, and suddenly something's happening on their doorstep that they haven't now got the opportunity to engage with? So I think there are some real skills and capacity challenges for local authorities, and I think the nature of the engagement and the consultation will need to change significantly, again requiring a different skill set. And that democratic process, so that goes to the heart of our current planning system, and it feels that is being watered down. I'm not going to say taken away, but watered down and changing. And I think we just need to be mindful of that and actually understand what that means for our local communities and for the planning system more broadly.
And I think all of those, those points are real challenges that we face, but we're in horse trading mode at the moment with government. So I think we need to come up with solutions. We need to offer fixes. So, for example, if 18 months is genuinely unrealistic for plan making, what's the right maximum figure that we should be pushing back with? Let's get out in the souk and start haggling. And the massive increase in requirements on local authorities to provide databases and information and digital resources. Well, that's a challenge, but there's never been a better opportunity now for us to argue for serious investment in enhancing historic environment records, in getting, recognizing that they are dynamic resources, that they change, that you can't just make one and then say, great, we've got one, that's it, all we ever need to know. We need to emphasize that historic environment record is a service. It's staffed by skilled people who can help people engage with it as a planning tool, as a research tool, and there's so many other things. Now, back in 2009, Heritage Protection Reform Bill in England was going to put historic environment records on a statutory footing. And I think we all knew at the time that the provision within the Act and then the definition of what a historic environment record was a bit of a Trojan horse. It was about getting historic environment services on a statutory footing. Maybe this time round we need to be more open about it and just say that we need to have much stronger guidance, potentially in statute, that local authorities have to provide these services. Okay, having made them have to provide these services like library services, how do we make sure that they're forced to provide an adequate service? That's going to be much more difficult. But I think we need to be talking about standards and perhaps getting some acknowledgement from government of what the standards of delivery need to be. As I say, now I think it's the time. And in the brief conversations that we have had, both with ministers and with civil servants, we've explained to them that if you want this new system to work, it's going to cost, it's going to need investment. And that obviously gets a bit of a political wince, but it's also getting an acknowledgement. So maybe what we have to do is indicate how much more investment is going to be needed. That's the sort of thing that I think would help Whitehall at this stage. Thank you.
Yes, Chris. Chris, I think you're on mute. Just
a thought on that one on investment, which is obviously a very, very difficult one to crack, and certainly won't crack it here in this meeting, but and it's an essential one. But I was just thinking that maybe there's a lot of mileage in cross-financing if they're trying to streamline the whole planning system, which we all welcome, and the very, very slow pace of some of the planning applications we work on. And it takes up all the planners' times as well. Perhaps there's a shifting of money from the back end to the front end, and if that could somehow be computed, that would perhaps be a very useful exercise.
Just, I mean, that is very much the approach that's talked about, isn't it? About investing much more in the plan making stage and having a less discretionary, more development management end, I do wonder how much saving we can make in development management when we will now have 3 systems for development management, where previously there was one principal approach. Actually, even that wasn't true. But streamlining by adding more variety, more routes, more options, and more complexity doesn't quite sound like an efficiency device to me.
Lisa.
Yeah, thanks for that. You've just reminded me of a thought. So I agree with you, Peter. I think government's vision is very much that you have a very labour-intensive front-loaded process, a lot of emphasis on plan making. The middle becomes much slimmer. Apparently, I'm not saying I agree with this, but this is government's vision that there is less discretionary decision making, and actually implicit in that is that also that the enforcement function will be the fallback position, actually. So you will have a more rules-based approach that is then delivered and checked, and the quality is checked through a robust enforcement process. And again, I think that hasn't been really clocked by government, actually, that our enforcement system is discretionary for a start. It's quite slow. It is, in my experience, reasonably inconsistent. It's highly politicized, and actually the punishments for non-compliance with an enforcement notice are actually quite limited. So again, it is about resourcing that. We just don't have a culture of a checking system. It's not really akin to building control. It's just not, and some other countries do have that, and we just don't. And it feels like government have sort of picked and chosen from what works well in other countries and what works well in other systems, and actually missed that our whole culture and setup is completely different to that. And I think it will take more than just investment. There needs to be some changes to the enforcement system, to the powers that local authorities have, to the speed, to the consistency, and I think that will be a really big culture change for local authorities and developers. Actually, there is no offence committed in planning terms until non-compliance with an enforcement notice. That's a very long way down the line. That's not when you've built something that doesn't comply with your design code. So I think there is a big piece of the process missing for me, actually, in the current system, that the white paper is actually silent on.
Thank you for that. I'm going to pick up some of those issues again shortly. I just wanted to bring in a few questions from delegates. Michael Hendry has asked, which does tie together some of these points. He would be interested to know the panel's thoughts regarding who pays to assess archaeology at the designation stage, and whether this risks the vast majority of sites not being investigated. And perhaps Peter would have a comment on this.
Yeah, well, it's a very good point by Michael, and it's one that we've made strongly to government, that essentially, what are we doing here? We're trying to bring certainty earlier into the process. That's what the white paper says. And I think, through growth and renewal areas, we can certainly bring certainty to developers earlier, that there will be a development. The exact nature of the development does seem to me to be coming later in the process. So we may be delaying, I'm interested in what Chris thinks about this, but that we might actually be delaying certainty about budget and program and detail. To ameliorate that problem, yes, you've got to have that information up front, and that will involve a degree of primary research. Geophysical survey, going out and digging holes, will be necessary in order to allocate some of these zones, areas, beg your pardon. And so that at the moment, and that predetermination evaluation is paid for by the applicant. We're now talking about a system where there isn't an applicant to pay for this. So it's got to be the local authority, or the local authority channeling someone else's money. Now, there's some noises out there about planning fees. I think it's a big ask of planning fees, using them as some kind of hypothecated tax to pay for future evaluations. I think that will be a challenge.
What about community infrastructure levy?
Maybe it's community infrastructure levy. That might be another way. Or maybe we're talking about a shift in the resourcing of this part of the planning process from local to central government, or put it differently, a bigger investment by central government in local government, recognizing that it's created a planning system that puts more burdens, more responsibilities onto the local planning authority, which of itself is not a bad thing, providing it's got the dosh to do it with.
Yes, Chris.
I think there was mention in the white paper about being able to track forward the community infrastructure levy, or the new name they're going to give it, and take receipts from the future plan and borrow on that basis. So it's just quite a clever incentive to get people to encourage them development in their areas. And the other point I was going to make was the idea of uncertainty that you mentioned, Peter, and for the developer. In fact, if you have a clear plan drawn up, then it's much more certainty for the developer. They know exactly what they're allowed to build. It's already agreed in the plan with the local authority, and there's very little risk, unless they want to challenge it. And then you come back to the old system, and then it's everybody's risk, and the developer will have to pay for it. But if the plan is set up correctly, it de-risks a lot for the developer and well, for everyone involved.
But can I just query that, Chris? Because, you know, it's a question about this new rules-based system is how many rules are there and who's writing them and where are they found? Because I can well see that you could identify an area to say, right, this is going to be a new area for housing. There will be some archaeological considerations of that, but that's okay. We think the housing is more important than preserving those heritage assets in situ. But there will need to be some excavation to offset the loss of fabric. We'll increase significance by providing more information about it. We'll disseminate that to the public. You know, all good, all old system. But if you've got a large area with 10 different developers building in it, the archaeology requirement is not going to be universally distributed across that landscape. There will be work required in certain areas. We don't know which areas those are at this stage. That will have to be evaluated at some point in the process. Now, we know at the moment that there's been pretty low take-up of permission in principle, simply because developers are kind of used to actually assessing what the archaeological implications of their scheme are, and it's easier to get that all out of the way before you slap your planning application in, because then you know what you're dealing with. And it just strikes me that you're not going to, you know you're going to build houses, but you don't know what the archaeological implications are going to be until you start building. That seems to me late in the process.
Thank you for that. I want to bring in another question from the delegates. Lawrence Rayner has asked, this is possibly for Karen, with the government proposal to dispense with the duty to cooperate, what are the panel's thoughts on how heritage assets that cross multiple LPA areas can be protected? For example, the Derwent Valley World Heritage Site, which spans at least 4 council areas.
Okay. Yeah, I suppose, you know, the duty to cooperate might disappear, but we've still got statements of common ground in the system. So I suppose that's one way in which you can carry on having those conversations about what's the differences or the similarities between neighbouring authorities, and what are those issues you're going to work with together and take forward. So I suppose for me, and my initial thought on that question would be that to a certain extent, the statements of common ground will be replacing the duty to cooperate requirements. I think that for me, the duty to cooperate requirements were primarily aimed at sorting out housing issues and the housing numbers debates between local authorities. So I think the idea of the statements of common ground is very much, you know, what are we both working on? What do we both agree on? What don't we agree on? And working on it from that point of view. So I think those hopefully will be the way in which we can work together across authorities where there's cross-boundary issues.
Thank you. I think that answers that question. We have another one from Jane Shepherd, who's also pointed out she's from the Cairngorms National Park Authority, so that is further away than Newcastle. Welcome. She suggested that in Scotland, every LPA were required to set up uniform software, which obviously a lot of LPAs in England use as well, It was rolled out in 2008, but wasn't entirely successful, as every LPA uses it differently, uses different fields and different data. It hasn't particularly made it easier for planners or the private sector. Information is available online for the user in a variety of ways, which is not consistent. So I suppose that is a sort of a warning against a nationwide mandatory rollout of software. I can speak from both sides, being in a local authority and outside of a local authority uniform, it's fine, but it is used differently. You get different results from different councils. It's not always simpler or cheaper internally for the council either. Any thoughts around that?
Just the one thought was that the planning system has been immensely simplified by having a universal planning portal that I don't know, is it privately run? I'm not sure actually.
It is, yeah, but it's very good.
Completely uniform, and you know exactly where you stand, and I think it's been a brilliant addition to the process. So
there's hope. Lisa and then Karen.
It might be a centrally managed software solution rather than left to each individual council to try and.
Very good point, actually. I think the inconsistency that Jay mentions is probably because it's been left to local authorities. They're given a sort of generic package and then they implement it differently. Whereas I think what you're saying with the portal, which I think is run by TerraQuest, it's nationally, centrally run. So every authority kind of connects into it more consistently, which I think is a good point. Lisa and then Karen.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think this goes to the heart of some of the concerns I was articulating earlier, and I agree. I think it does need to be consistent and to be managed centrally, because any system is only as good as the end user and actually the information you put in. I think another observation I would have is that I think with lots of systems we have a tendency, or there is a tendency, to digitize existing analog systems, and I think we need to be really innovative about what information do we need to capture and not just move an existing analog system to a digital format, because we could probably do things quite differently actually, and I think there are probably some organisations we could learn from. PINs are rolling out some new systems and testing some new systems that are moving away from the requirement to submit all of your local plan policies, because actually everybody can get a copy of that. You don't need to send a copy of all of the plans. So I think thinking slightly differently feels really important, and I think this is the moment to do something different that works really well.
I think just in terms of local authority perspective, I suppose it's very much as Lisa said, the devil is always in the detail and what is inputted by the members of staff that are inputting that data. So I think it needs to be something that's probably coming top down from government as to what's the best system to use, what data are they trying to collect nationally for the benefit of everybody, and then having very set standards as to what data are you collecting in your areas, so that everybody's collecting the same level and information, and have had the training on what information are they supposed to be inputting into this system, and how does this system work for the benefit of everybody.
I
can see that, but just knowing that historic environment records, for example, have been involved very much by historic environment record staff, the experts in the local authority that working with other local authorities, there's been a raft of initiatives to develop appropriate standards, and I do just slightly fear that a top-down directive from government saying these are the data that matter and those are the data that don't matter could be quite problematic. So it would need a bit of top-down direction, maybe, but it needs to be informed from bottom-up expertise.
Thank you very much. Catherine Jeter has just mentioned a system being developed by the London Borough of Southwark called BOPS, BOPS, which is designing a national back-office database system, and it's available to look at BOPS_digital on Twitter if anyone wants to have a look. So we'll look at that later. Bit of a quick fire round. I wanted to, I'll come back to the positives of the white paper in a minute, but I wanted to start and return back to the start of this and just mention two things which are not included in the white paper and seek your views. First of all, Peter mentioned that archaeology isn't covered. So perhaps get Peter's views on that. And Lisa mentioned that cultural landscape's not mentioned, and colleagues with us from national park authorities will probably be very familiar with cultural landscapes, but other people probably have never heard of it. So perhaps you just want to explain what that is and explain what you'd prefer to see covered in the white paper. So Peter first.
Yes, archaeology, I mean, a word not mentioned in the white paper has caused some squirming and some apologies and some grovelling from government. So to that extent, the lack of mention of it has been quite helpful, because it's opened doors, and it's enabled us to obtain through parliamentary questions and the like some pretty good ministerial reassurances, at least of intention. So now what we've got to deal with is unintended consequences of planning reform rather than intended consequences. Sometimes I don't worry too much if archaeology isn't mentioned, because archaeology, like conservation, is one of the disciplines that we apply to the historic environment. And so long as the historic environment or heritage is mentioned, then I'm comfortable that we've got an opportunity to talk about archaeology. Obviously, if people think that the only thing you have to do with the historic environment is draw lines around it and conserve it, then that clearly doesn't work. But yes, I think that the issue about cultural landscapes, which I will pass on to a more informed colleagues, is a really important point, that heritage is spread out.
Thank you. Yeah. So as an organisation, obviously the National Trust, we deal with buildings, coastline and countryside. We own lots of land, and for us, cultural landscapes are sometimes quite intangible and quite hard to define. They're even harder to draw boundaries around than designated assets or national parks or AONBs. And they're really landscapes that people feel an affinity with. They are very emotionally connected to those. And probably the best example I could give is something like Bronte's country. We all have an image in our head of Wuthering Heights and what that means for us. And they can be really huge generators of tourism, actually, and they can be really important to local economies as well as bring in a character of itself. And I think they're hard to define, that you won't find a definition of them. We might have a sense of those that are important to us, and they tend to straddle boundaries, local authority boundaries, area boundaries, county boundaries. They are very slippery, but they are hugely important. And I think for me, something that is missing in the white paper, as well as a broad definition of heritage and including cultural landscapes, is really the strategic layer. How do we deal with things at scale? And that feels really, really important. And I think that is what's needed to address things like cultural landscapes and ecology. Actually, there are lots of things that will straddle boundaries. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very clear. So I'd like to turn it to sort of a positive angle, I suppose. What positives in the white paper have you seen that you think should be brought forward, and enacted, and will actually help heritage? Peter.
I'll have a go, Gareth. I've described our position to government as being nervously optimistic, in that there are all sorts of potential opportunities in a reformed planning system, and indeed a system reformed along these lines. The nervousness comes from the huge risks of accidental damage to it. But on the positives, we're dealing, in terms of archaeological research at the moment, there may be regional research frameworks, there may be overall strategies for investigating that wider landscape that Lisa talks about. But it's very episodic in its nature. One development is a keyhole view into the past. I'd say Karen nodding, even something as compact as the city of Canterbury. And each is budgeted for separately. We need mechanisms to synthesize the different pockets of data that we accumulate over the years. We need to ask more sophisticated questions than we can ask of a single site. So there is the possibility that if you've got a good archaeological policy in a plan making stage, you could direct research to ensure much more interesting results and much greater public benefit from the research than we're getting at the moment, which I will immediately have to say doesn't mean that I don't think huge amounts of public research aren't generated out of the current system. We know they are. We know it's transformed our understanding of the past, but I think we could capitalize on that so much more under a new system, providing the right safeguards are built in and the right resources are built in.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've talked already that heritage is in the white paper, and I think that is hugely positive. Whatever we think about the broader definition of it, it's on the radar. And I agree with Peter. Actually, I think at the highest levels of government there is a genuine desire to get this right and a genuine concern. I think for me the positives in the white paper are quite broad. Actually, I'm really pleased that planning and planners are seen as important. It talks really positively about planners. We are the solution. We are the people that can drive delivery and deliver great spaces. Placemaking. I'm really pleased that placemaking and design are on the agenda as really front and center issues. They're not tacked in around the edges, and I think there's a real opportunity to do something really, really powerful with that. And I agree. And although this will come out as a negative, I think it's a positive. I think there is a real moment here to support local authorities and to really tackle this legacy of underinvestment, and to really get some secure funding and resources and skills back into local authorities to deliver this paper. And I think there are some really strong arguments to do that, so I would see it as an opportunity. The other thing that I think is a real opportunity in the white paper is the ability to join up historic environment and the natural environment and talk about carbon neutral, truly sustainable development. And I think as we move out of COVID, the real opportunity for a truly green, sustainable recovery, we could really get some traction there. So I think there's lots of positives, actually, lots to build. And it's not all bad. Might be a bit unclear, but it's not all bad.
I think that's, as you say, it's a change in attitude towards the planning profession from, I forget which, it was perhaps David Cameron called planning a drag anchor on the economy, which I thought was a bit harsh. But yeah, that's a good point. Chris.
Yeah, I just although there's a lot of words and positivity between all the sentences in the white paper, that sort of you think yeah, and we've all discussed actually the problems with it, because it is a lot of words and you need to get the action behind it. The basic principle, I saw parallels with the German system of the Bebauungsplan, and similarly what we would see is a very simplistic single piece of paper that captures all the policies in an area and what you're allowed to build. I was involved with some research on studying exemplary sustainable development in European countries, and we were learning from that and trying to bring it back to the UK. And one of these things was this very well researched Bebauungsplan that had put the core pieces of development in place already and enabled a much smoother rollout of sustainable development on a large scale. And it had to be said, one of the key messages was you need to give that plan time to be developed. And I think it's something that we in the private sector as well as the local authorities have to work together to produce, because the local authority can't produce it all on its own. It'll be subcontracted to people who understand it, and they'll all help produce these plans. But I think it's a very positive way forward.
Should we ask government for a second consultation once a lot of the detail that we've been discussing today is sort of fleshed out? I think I'm getting a lot of nods and thumbs up, but is
yes,
that something
absolutely,
that
absolutely.
we can go to ministers with?
Critical. It feels absolutely critical. There is not enough detail in the white paper for this round to be a meaningful consultation response. And in fact, many of our responses are we're not sure because it just depends. And that's probably a an indication that more clarity and further consultation is absolutely essential.
Yes, Karen.
Yeah, I think the government's emphasis really in this white paper is almost a direction of travel as to where they would like things to get to, but it lacks the detail of how they're actually going to get there, which I think is our opportunity as the people here as part of the panel, but also everybody watching today, to actually work together to put forward our ideas as to how we think this could work in practice, because at the end of the day, what they want is to get delivery happening and things happening on the ground. Because they perceive that the system's too slow or not simple enough for people to understand and to move things along quickly enough for their liking. I think that's where they're coming from. So I think it's our opportunity to feed into that and say how we think this could work in practice.
I agree, and it's it's not unwelcome, the lack of detail in this consultation. It's nice to be having a public debate about these issues before governmental minds are made up. But I do think, that would be a very helpful takeaway from the meeting today if we can report back to government that, we in our collective wisdom, I don't know if we haven't quite got a poll for the audience on this, but I'm sure we'll be told in the chat column if we got it horribly wrong. But if we could take away that request to government, I think that would be useful. Also, the indications that we've had from government is that minds aren't completely made up about all of the detail. As Karen says, these are ideas being floated. So, if the world came back and said, no, we don't want 3 different types of area, we want 5 or we want 2 or what have you, then that might be where we end up. So the next stage of the proposals could be, and maybe will be, markedly different from what we're looking at now, and that, I think, in a democratic society requires a second go.
Thank you. At this point, we're going to try and launch the 3 polls. So this is where everything will either go horribly wrong or go smoothly. So Susan's going to try and action the first poll question. So for all the delegates, you should see a question flash across your screen with hopefully some answers. So you simply click on the answer that you want. If you don't want to vote, you don't have to. We're going to allow about 30 seconds, 45 seconds for each question. There'll be 3, and we'll continue to talk in the background, assuming you can still hear this. While those questions are up on people's screens, a good thing to discuss with the panel in the background is we've had a classic question from Nick Baldrini, which is that essentially, if it's not broken, why fix it? Maybe a yes or no answer. Do we think that the planning system is sufficiently broken to warrant widespread reforms? I suppose you could look at it the other way around, that if it is, do you think these reforms are the right ones? I think that every government tries to reform planning. It seems to be a bit of a go-to to try and kickstart the economy. It's been described as bonfire of the quangos before, removing the drag anchor, slashing red tape and so on, but ultimately people end up returning back to a relatively similar system. So perhaps what are the panel's thoughts on this?
Well, as an architect, I'm on that side of the planning system. We find it a very complex and often subjective and politicized decision-making process, and would welcome a more a clearer initial plan as set out. Some of the local plans aren't complete, or they take years and years and years to develop and are very quickly out of date. Flexibility is something we didn't talk about today, but I think that has to be somehow brought into this local plan system that's been talked about. But yeah, I think the system has strengths, but I think it's in need of reform.
I think my contribution would be that no system is beyond improvement. Whether these are the reforms we need is a slightly different question, and I recognise where Nick's coming from. A lot of sympathies there. I'm sure there's scope for improvements. I think the government is right that a lot of the problems with the planning system have been through tinkering and accretion of more complexities onto an existing system. So that that's a good analysis of the problem. I'm not sure this is necessarily the reform. And yes, governments always tinker with the planning system. It's a lot cheaper to alter the planning system than it is to invest in building a lot of houses.
Karen?
Yeah, I think as a planner, I think there's always scope to improve whatever we do as planners, and there's always different ways of doing things and new systems that might improve what we do. So from the perspective of just bringing something in new, if it works, fine. I think the aim is obviously to get development on the ground though, and whether this system will actually increase house builders in particular, which is where the government's emphasis tends to be, whether that will increase house builders actually coming to us and building on the ground and getting the houses out there is another question.
Yeah, I think my reflection would be, as an ex-local authority planner and now dealing with local planning authorities across the countries, the biggest challenge that we find is consistency. Actually, things are done very differently in many local authorities, and that is a real challenge actually when you're trying to navigate the system as a developer and as an applicant. I would say though that I fundamentally disagree that the planning system is the blocking to housing delivery, and I'm not convinced that the changes proposed will result in any more houses actually being delivered. So I think there's a slight misdiagnosis of the problem, but I would agree that yes, there is always scope to improve a system.
Thank you. Any other thoughts while we're going through question 2 on the poll?
I thought there were some quite interesting responses to question 1. That seemed to be a large majority of people thinking that the definition of heritage was problematic. So perhaps we will get a better definition in that second consultation we've just promised ourselves.
That's right, and I think we can use these poll results as a non-scientific bit of feedback as well. I think if those at home saw the first question answered, it was 63% did think that heritage was too narrow. I think that's quite obvious, a kind of response from the first and second session that I think the government has oversimplified what heritage means, and we've drawn that out. So the poll question 2 is just flashed up. Should non-designated heritage assets be given additional protection in the white paper? And 81% of respondents think yes, which is more than I was expecting, perhaps. I think we didn't actually come back to the question that Lisa raised at the beginning about non-designated heritage assets, but I know in the private sector there is some difficulty in knowing what is and is not a non-designated heritage asset sometimes. But it is interesting that people do think that they should be given additional protection. Does anyone have any thoughts?
Well, I'm hugely reassured by that, actually, that there seems to be a consensus that there's a lot out there. And I think it's something that people intuitively know, actually. And it goes back to the point that Chris made, about the richness of that local input and that local knowledge. Actually, it doesn't have to be a listed building for people to really, value that locally. So, I feel hugely reassured by that. That's, good.
Yes, I'd agree that there are lots of safeguards that need to be added in, building on the successes of the current system, but making it better than what we've got at the moment. And the risk is that it would be so easy to make it much worse and for those non-designated assets to be left unloved.
We have the final poll question up now about LPA resourcing, particularly touching on, I think, what Karen was speaking about earlier with the 18-month window to bring in new local plan making and design code criteria. I could probably predict the answer to this one already, but it'd be interesting to see what people say. I think there is a role for the private sector certainly in producing this work, particularly around the evidence base. I think a lot of private practices can produce design codes and master planning actually to assist. Well, there's the answers to question 3. Perhaps unsurprising, 94% of people do not feel that LPAs are sufficiently resourced to deliver the plan making and design code requirements within the set timescale. So I suppose the outcome of that would be we either need more resource or more timescales. I'd suggest that the former is probably the wiser approach. This perhaps just corroborates kind of what we were already discussing as a panel, but does anyone have any additional reflections on that?
I think if we'd run a sweepstake, it would have been quite interesting just to see, who got closest. But I was 4% out. But I suppose the question is what we do with that information, really. But I think we've got to express that to government, not just as give local authorities more money, but actually it's your choice. You can either change the planning system to something radically different and invest in it, or you can say, you know what, maybe we'll just do a little bit of tidying up with what we've got. So it goes back to that previous question from Nick, really, in the audience.
Lisa, Karen, and then Chris, if you have a last word just before we wrap up, because we're just at the end of our slot now.
Yeah, thank you. Just briefly, I don't think the resource challenge should be underestimated, actually. So I think even if more resource did come our way or local authorities' way, I still think there will be a challenge with those timescales. Actually, I just don't think it's doable, actually, even with significant investment and significant resource.
I think in terms of the local authority side of things, I suppose, again, I would agree with Lisa there, because you can throw as much money as you like at the local planning authority, but if they don't have officers to actually do the work, then it's going to fall on the private sector to help the local authority to get all this workload done, I think. The other thing I was just going to mention too is it's not just the local planning authority that would need resourcing, but you'll need all the other agencies that get involved with plan making to actually feed their data and information in. So people like Natural England, the Environment Agency, Historic England, and so on, all the different agencies that might put in information through to us highways agents. I could go on with all the people that provide us with information and evidence, but also for the planning inspectorate. We've not touched on that today, but the emphasis in the white paper currently is almost like the planning inspectorate will decide how they'll do the examination, and they might go by written reps. They might invite you to turn up and talk to them, and the emphasis seems to be on the planning inspectorate to decide what format of examination they might hold, which I think will go back to the fact that then it's how are the public involved and how do the public feel that their message or their views are being taken seriously by a planning inspector if they're not holding a public meeting where everyone can turn up and say their piece. If they feel like they only get to write something to the planning inspector and they don't actually get physically seen by them, or virtually seen if it's anything like today. But I think that there's issues around that we've obviously not touched upon today, but I think it's a bigger resourcing issue than just us as a local planning authority doing the plan. It's all the knock-on effects to everybody else, because I think there'll be more challenges further down the line at the examination stage where the public will just say they haven't had a proper chance at inputting into the local plan process. There'll be more legal challenges, I think, down the line.
Thank you. And Chris, a word for the road?
Yeah. Just I mentioned the systems we studied in Europe. They allowed 5 to 7 years for planning for the local plan. Perhaps that's too long, but in parallel to that, and you can't really judge the time it's going to take until you address this other element, which they refer to the design codes, and they're going to bring out a paper with some prototype document that will illustrate what the design code should include. But until we've seen what they think that should incorporate, you can't possibly judge how long it's all going to take, because there's going to be a level of detail we haven't yet seen there. So we'll be watching the space.
Thank you very much. It really falls to me just to draw the this event to a close. Just want to thanks very much to our speakers on the panel. Your time is much appreciated, as well as your expertise. And thank you to all the delegates for your questions and for joining us today. And I hope the debate format has been interesting. It's certainly a different way of running these events to what we're used to with sort of normal presentations. So I hope that's been insightful. Please do post your thoughts on Twitter via the RTPI's handle at RTPI Southeast and complete the survey that will appear once this webinar finishes. You can also subscribe to the RTPI YouTube channel at youtube.com/the RTPI, so you're notified of all the videos as soon as they're released, and a recording of this session will be available soon, so you can rewatch or revisit some of the issues or share it with colleagues. So thanks to everyone for your time today, and see you at the next event.